To better choices, Daniel said, lifting his glass just high enough for the chandelier light to catch the ring on his finger, and the table answered with laughter that felt too loud, too rehearsed, like a performance everyone had agreed on before she arrived. Evelyn Carter stood there for half a second longer than necessary, not frozen, just measuring the room the way someone measures a space they've already memorized. The scent of aged oak and citrus polish lingered in the air, soft jazz hummed somewhere behind the marble columns, and Vanessa leaned back in her chair with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't think she'd actually come," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. And that was when the first ripple of quiet embarrassment passed through the surrounding tables, not for Evelyn, but for the spectacle itself. Daniel gestured casually to the empty seat across from him, the one placed just slightly off-center as if it had been added last minute. "Sit, Evelyn," he said, like he was offering generosity instead of staging a scene. And she did, smooth, unhurried, placing her clutch beside the plate with a precision that felt almost out of place against the careless energy around her. A waiter approached, hesitated, then stepped back again without taking her order, and in that flicker of uncertainty, something shifted, subtle, nearly invisible. Evelyn noticed it, not with her eyes, but with the way the air changed. Vanessa picked up her wine glass, swirling it lazily before letting her elbow tilt just enough, a thin line of red slipping over the rim and landing on Evelyn's sleeve. "Oh my God," she said flatly, not reaching for a napkin, not even pretending. The table laughed again, softer this time, watching for a reaction, waiting for something to justify the moment. But Evelyn didn't move. She looked down at the stain for a breath, then lifted her gaze, not to Vanessa, not to Daniel, but past them, toward the far end of the room where the manager stood, and for a fraction of a second, he met her eyes and straightened, just slightly, like a reflex he didn't realize he still had. Daniel leaned back, satisfied, tapping his glass once more. "You always did hate scenes," he said, mistaking her stillness for weakness. And Evelyn let the silence settle, not heavy, not tense, just complete, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table, a small, almost absent gesture, but one that didn't belong to a guest, one that belonged to someone who understood exactly how everything in that room was arranged, how it functioned, how it answered when called. The music continued, the laughter faded, and somewhere behind the polished walls, something unseen had already begun to shift in her favor. The stain on her sleeve began to dry, darkening into a deeper shade as the minutes passed. But Evelyn did not ask for another napkin, and she did not excuse herself. She simply sat there as if nothing had happened, as if she had chosen this exact seat, this exact moment. And Daniel kept talking, filling the silence with stories about his latest deal. Numbers thrown casually into the air like confetti, figures that once would have impressed her, once would have meant something, but now they sounded distant, like echoes from a life she no longer lived. Vanessa leaned closer to him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her laughter quick and bright, practiced, every gesture designed to be seen, to be compared, to be measured against the woman sitting across from her. And still Evelyn did not compete. She did not interrupt. She did not even glance at them for long. Instead, her attention drifted again, slow and deliberate, tracing the edges of the room, the polished bar, the soft glow of pendant lights, the quiet efficiency of the staff moving in perfect rhythm. And each time her eyes passed over them, something subtle happened, a hesitation, a flicker of recognition, a quiet shift in posture, like they were remembering something they had almost forgotten. Daniel noticed none of it. He raised his glass again. "You know, Evelyn always preferred staying home," he said with a small smirk. "Never really liked places like this." And a few people at the table nodded, accepting the version of her he offered without question. But Evelyn's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement of how easily narratives could be rewritten when no one bothered to verify them. Her fingers brushed the table once more, that same absent gesture, and this time a server nearby paused mid-step before continuing on. Vanessa caught it, just barely, her eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second before she dismissed it, turning back to Daniel with a brighter smile. "Well, people change," she said, her tone light, but edged, and Evelyn finally spoke, her voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to settle the space around them without demanding attention. "They do," she said, and nothing more, no explanation, no defense. Just two words that seemed to land heavier than anything Daniel had said all evening. The conversation stumbled after that, not stopping, but losing its rhythm, like music played a beat too late, and in that subtle dissonance, the balance of the room shifted again, almost imperceptibly. Daniel cleared his throat, reaching for another story, another attempt to reclaim the energy, but somewhere between his words and the soft clink of glass, it became clear that the scene was no longer entirely under his control, and Evelyn sat there, composed, untouched by the performance unfolding around her, as if she were not a guest enduring the night, but something else entirely, something the room itself was beginning to recognize before anyone at the table could understand it. The air shifted again, quieter now, as if the room itself had taken a breath and forgotten how to release it. And Evelyn could feel it without looking, the subtle recalibration of attention, the way conversations at nearby tables softened just enough to listen without appearing to listen. Daniel continued speaking, but his voice no longer carried the same ease. His words slightly rushed, slightly louder, like he was trying to reclaim something slipping through his fingers. Vanessa noticed it too, her posture straightening, her smile tightening at the edges as she reached for her glass again. But this time she did not spill. This time her movements were careful, controlled, as if she suddenly understood that the stage beneath her feet was not entirely hers. Evelyn let her gaze drift once more, not scanning, not searching, simply acknowledging. The bar where a bartender paused mid-polish. The entrance where a hostess adjusted her stance the moment their eyes met. The manager still standing at a distance but no longer uncertain. And in each of those small reactions there was something consistent, something that did not belong to coincidence, something that belonged to recognition. Daniel leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to sound more personal, more pointed. "I have to admit, I am surprised you showed up like this," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to her sleeve, to the faint mark that had not fully disappeared. "It is not really your scene." And for a moment the table leaned in with him, waiting for her to either defend herself or retreat into silence. But Evelyn did neither. She lifted her hand just slightly, not to hide the stain but to smooth the fabric as if it were nothing more than a crease. Her movements unhurried, precise, and when she looked up again her expression had not changed, calm, composed, but there was something else beneath it now, something that did not need to be named to be felt. "You are right," she said softly, her voice even, measured. It was not, and the past tense settled between them like a quiet correction, not sharp enough to provoke, but clear enough to be understood. Vanessa let out a small laugh, a little too quick. "Well, people reinvent themselves all the time," she said, but there was a question hidden beneath her tone now, one she did not fully realize she was asking. Evelyn did not respond immediately. Instead, her fingers brushed the table again, that same subtle gesture, and this time the reaction came faster. A server changed direction mid-step, another straightened a tray. The manager began to move, not rushed, not dramatic, just intentional, and Daniel finally noticed, his eyes flickering past Evelyn toward the approaching figure, confusion replacing the confidence he had worn so easily before. "Is there a problem?" he asked, half turning in his seat, but the manager did not answer him, his attention fixed entirely on Evelyn, stopping just a few feet from the table, posture aligned, expression composed, waiting, not for permission to speak, but for acknowledgement. And for the first time that evening, the silence that followed was not something Daniel could fill. It belonged to her. The manager stopped just short of the table, his presence quiet but undeniable, and for a moment no one spoke, not because they were choosing silence, but because something in the room had already decided it for them. Evelyn did not look up immediately. She let the pause stretch, just enough to make it clear that she was not reacting. She was allowing. And when she finally lifted her gaze, it was not with surprise, not with curiosity, but with recognition, the kind that had been there long before this evening began. "Good evening, Miss Carter," the manager said, his voice steady, respectful, carrying just enough to reach the table but not enough to invite the rest of the room in. And the shift was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. Daniel blinked, the name landing a second too late, as if it had been spoken in a language he suddenly did not understand. Vanessa's smile faltered, just briefly, before she tried to recover it. "I think you have the wrong person," she said lightly. But her tone lacked the certainty it had held all night. The manager did not look at her, did not acknowledge the interruption. His attention remained on Evelyn, waiting, always waiting, as if the next moment belonged entirely to her. Evelyn reached for her napkin then, not to clean the stain, but to fold it slowly, precisely, placing it beside her plate. A small, deliberate action that carried more weight than anything said so far. "Thank you," she replied, her voice calm, unchanged, as if this exchange were the most natural thing in the world, and perhaps to her, it was. Daniel shifted in his seat, a faint crease forming between his brows. "What is this?" he asked, not quite to the manager, not quite to Evelyn, but to the space between them, searching for something familiar to hold on to, but nothing in the moment answered him. The manager straightened slightly. "We were not expecting you this evening, Miss Carter," he continued. "Would you like us to prepare your usual table instead?" And that was when the silence deepened, not empty, but full, heavy with implication. Vanessa's fingers tightened around her glass, the soft clink against the table the only sound she made. Daniel let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but it did not land. "Usual table?" he repeated, the words sounding foreign in his own voice. And Evelyn met his gaze then, fully, not with challenge, not with triumph, just with a quiet clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. "I am fine here," she said, her tone gentle, almost considerate, but final, and the manager inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that felt closer to deference than service, before stepping back, not turning his back on her until he had created enough distance to make it appropriate. And as he moved away, the room seemed to settle into a new alignment, subtle but irreversible. Daniel leaned back slowly, his earlier confidence now replaced by something less defined, something searching. "Since when?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it, and Evelyn's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, more like the edge of one. "Since it mattered," she said softly, and in that moment, it became clear that whatever story Daniel thought he was telling tonight, he was no longer the one in control of how it ended. Daniel did not reach for his glass again, not immediately. His hand hovered there for a second before settling back onto the table, as if even that simple motion required more certainty than he currently had. And Vanessa shifted in her seat, crossing one leg over the other with a little more force than necessary, the soft scrape of her heel against the floor breaking the fragile quiet that had settled between them. "This is ridiculous," she said with a light laugh that tried to recover the mood, but only exposed the tension beneath it. "It is just a misunderstanding." But no one at the table moved to agree with her. No one rushed to restore the easy rhythm from earlier, because something fundamental had already changed, something that could not be undone by dismissing it. Evelyn remained exactly where she was, composed, untouched, as if the moment unfolding had always been part of her plan, not something that surprised her, not something that required reaction. And Daniel leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice again. But this time it was not to impress, it was to confirm. "You come here often?" he asked, the question careful, almost cautious, and Evelyn let the silence answer first, just long enough to make him feel it. "Sometimes," she said finally, her tone neutral, giving him nothing more than what he had asked for, nothing extra to hold on to. And Vanessa let out a short breath, shaking her head. "Please, Daniel, it is just a restaurant," she said, but her eyes flickered around the room again, noticing now what she had missed before, the way the staff moved with a subtle awareness whenever they passed near their table, the way conversations nearby seemed to soften, not out of curiosity, but out of respect, and it unsettled her, not because she understood it, but because she did not. Daniel followed her gaze this time, slower, more deliberate, and for the first time that evening, he was not looking at Evelyn as someone he had already defined. He was looking at her as something he had not yet figured out, something that no longer fit into the version of her he had carried with him since the divorce. "You never mentioned this," he said, almost to himself, and Evelyn's expression softened just slightly, not with sympathy, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement. "There are a lot of things you never asked about," she replied, her voice steady, not accusing, not defensive, just stating a fact that did not need to be argued. And that was what unsettled him the most, not the words themselves, but the absence of emotion behind them, as if whatever they had once shared no longer held enough weight to disturb her. Vanessa straightened again, her smile returning, but sharper now, more controlled. "Well, it still does not change anything," she said, her tone firm, as if anchoring herself to something solid. "We are celebrating tonight." And she reached for Daniel's hand, squeezing it lightly, a gesture meant to re-establish their position, their narrative, their control of the evening. But Daniel did not respond immediately, his attention still lingering on Evelyn, on the calm certainty in her posture, on the quiet way the room seemed to orbit her without making it obvious. And for a brief moment, something like doubt crossed his face, subtle but real, before he masked it again with a small nod. Picking up his glass at last, "Right," he said, though the word lacked the conviction it had earlier, and across from him, Evelyn sat in perfect stillness, not needing to interrupt, not needing to prove anything, because the shift had already begun, and everyone at the table could feel it. Even if they could not yet name it, the music shifted into a slower rhythm, barely noticeable unless someone was paying attention, and Evelyn noticed, not because she was listening for it, but because she was used to environments adjusting around her without needing instruction, the kind of subtle control that did not announce itself but existed all the same. Daniel finally took a sip of his drink, though it looked more like a reflex than a choice, his eyes still drifting back to Evelyn as if trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the version he had left behind. And Vanessa, sensing that distance, leaned closer again, her voice brighter, sharper. "So, Evelyn," she said, drawing out the name just enough to reclaim attention, "what do you actually do now?" And the question hung there, layered with curiosity, but edged with something else, something probing, something that wanted to reduce her back into something understandable, something smaller. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, considering not the question, but the intent behind it, and she answered simply, "I invest." 2 words, clean, complete, offering no details to dissect, no openings to challenge. And Vanessa smiled, though it did not quite settle. "In what, exactly?" she pressed, and Daniel watched closely now, no longer amused, no longer detached, but attentive in a way he had not been all evening. Evelyn's fingers rested lightly against the table, still, composed. "Things that last," she said, and again, "nothing more," and the ambiguity of it seemed to carry more weight than any list of achievements could have, because it refused to be measured in the way they expected. Vanessa let out a small breath, glancing at Daniel as if to share a reaction, but he did not mirror it, his focus still fixed across the table, the earlier confidence replaced by a quiet calculation, as if he were revisiting memories, searching for signs he might have missed, moments he might have overlooked, and finding none that explained this, none that justified how far she now seemed from his understanding. A server approached then, placing a fresh glass of water beside Evelyn without being asked, the movement smooth, almost rehearsed, and for a brief second, their eyes met, the server offering a slight nod before stepping away, not lingering, not intruding, just acknowledging, and Vanessa noticed that too, her posture tightening again. "Interesting," she said, her tone lighter now, but carefully controlled. "Must be nice," and Evelyn allowed a faint smile to touch her lips, not in response to the comment, but to something quieter, something internal, as if the remark no longer had the power to reach her in any meaningful way. Daniel set his glass down, slower this time, the sound softer, deliberate. "You always said you did not care about this kind of life," he said, not accusing, not quite questioning, just stating something he had once believed to be certain, and Evelyn met his gaze without hesitation. "I said I did not care about what it represented back then," she replied, her voice even, her expression unchanged. "There is a difference," and the distinction settled between them, subtle but undeniable, because it suggested growth, evolution, a shift he had not been part of, a journey he had not witnessed, and for the first time that evening, Daniel looked at her not as someone he had outgrown, but as someone who had moved forward without him. And across the table, Vanessa sat a little straighter, her smile returning once more. But this time it felt less like confidence and more like defense, as if she too could Sensed that whatever ground they thought they were standing on was no longer as stable as it had seemed when the night began. Vanessa let out a soft laugh again. But this time it lingered too long, stretched thin by something she could not quite hide, and she leaned back in her chair as if reclaiming space that no longer felt entirely hers. "You know what? This is getting a little dramatic for a dinner," she said, her tone light, but sharpened at the edges. "Maybe we should keep things simple." And she raised her hand slightly, catching the attention of a passing server, her voice shifting just enough to carry authority. "Excuse me, could you check if everything here is appropriate?" she added, her eyes flicking briefly toward Evelyn, the implication clear even if the words were not. And for a moment, the table seemed to hold its breath again, waiting to see if the balance would tilt back in her favor. The server paused, not immediately responding, not moving closer, just standing there with a hesitation that spoke louder than any answer. And that hesitation was all it took. Daniel noticed it, his gaze sharpening as he followed the server's line of sight, not to Vanessa, but to Evelyn. And something in his expression shifted again, not confusion this time, but realization beginning to form, slow and reluctant, like a truth he had not wanted to consider. "Is there an issue?" he asked, his voice lower now, more controlled, but lacking the ease it once had. The server straightened slightly. "No issue, sir," he replied carefully, but his eyes moved again, almost instinctively, back to Evelyn, waiting, always waiting. And Vanessa's smile faltered once more, this time more visibly, her fingers tightening against the edge of the table. "Then why are you standing there?" she pressed, the lightness gone now, replaced by a hint of urgency she could not quite suppress. And before the server could answer, another presence entered the space, not abruptly, not with force, but with a quiet certainty that drew attention without asking for it. Alexander Hayes stepped beside the table, his posture relaxed, his expression composed, as if he had been there all along and was only now choosing to be seen. His gaze moved briefly across Daniel, across Vanessa, and then settled on Evelyn, not questioning, not surprised, simply acknowledging. "I was wondering how long you would let this go on," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational, and the familiarity in it landed differently than anything else that had been said that night. Daniel straightened, his focus shifting immediately. "And you are?" he asked, the question edged with the need to reassert control, to understand the new variable entering the equation. Alexander did not answer him right away. Instead, he reached for the back of the empty chair beside Evelyn, resting his hand there lightly, a gesture that was not possessive, not performative, just deliberate. And then he spoke, not to Daniel, but to the space itself. "Someone who prefers not to interrupt unless it matters," he said, before his eyes returned to Evelyn, a silent question passing between them, one that did not need words to be understood. And Evelyn held his gaze for a brief second before giving the slightest nod, a decision made without announcement. And in that small exchange, the last piece of the evening shifted into place, because whatever uncertainty had lingered before was gone now, replaced by something clearer, something undeniable. And for the first time since she walked into the room, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, not retreating, but settling into a position that felt unmistakably like ownership, while across from her, Daniel and Vanessa sat in a silence that no longer belonged to them. Daniel's question never received a direct answer, not in the way he expected, because the answer was already unfolding in front of him, piece by piece, in the way the room responded, in the way Alexander stood without urgency, without explanation, as if introductions were unnecessary when position spoke louder than names. Vanessa's eyes moved quickly between them, calculating, searching for something she could still control. "I think we are done here," she said suddenly, her voice sharper now, reaching for an ending she could still define. But the moment did not follow her lead. It stayed exactly where Evelyn allowed it to be, unhurried, composed, and Alexander finally shifted his attention toward Daniel, his expression calm, almost polite. "You invited her here," he said, not accusing, not challenging, just stating something simple, something undeniable. It would be a shame to rush the evening, and there was a quiet weight behind the words, something that made it clear this was no longer about dinner. Daniel held his gaze for a second, then another, before looking away first, a small break. But enough. I did not realize this was your place, he said, the sentence incomplete, because he did not yet know how to finish it. How to name what had already become obvious. Alexander's response was subtle, a slight tilt of his head, a glance toward Evelyn rather than away from her. It is hers, he said, simply, and the finality in those two words settled over the table like a quiet closing of a door. Vanessa's breath caught, just briefly, her posture stiffening as if she had misheard. Excuse me, she said. But no one rushed to clarify. No one softened it, because there was nothing to soften. Daniel looked back at Evelyn then. Really looked this time, not at the surface, not at the version he remembered, but at the presence in front of him, the calm certainty, the absence of hesitation, and slowly, the realization completed itself. Not dramatic, not explosive, just undeniable. You bought this place, he said, more statement than question, and Evelyn met his gaze without resistance, without pride, just clarity. Yes, she replied, her voice even, as if confirming something routine, something that did not require explanation. The silence that followed was different now, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, like something had reached its natural conclusion. Vanessa looked around the room again, but this time what she saw was not elegant lighting or polished decor. It was hierarchy, structure, a system that no longer placed her at the center, and for the first time that evening, she had nothing to say. Daniel leaned back slowly, the energy that had carried him through the night gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier. Why did you not say anything? He asked, the question softer now, stripped of ego, almost genuine, and Evelyn's expression did not change. Because you did not ask, she said, and the simplicity of it landed deeper than anything else, because it was true, because it always had been. Alexander stepped back then, not leaving, just creating space, as if the moment no longer required his presence to hold it together, and Evelyn reached for her glass, lifting it with the same steady grace she had carried all evening, not to toast, not to mark victory, just to take a quiet sip, and in that small, ordinary action, the entire balance of the night was sealed, because nothing more needed to be proven, nothing more needed to be said. Everything that mattered had already been understood. Daniel did not speak again right away, not because he had nothing to say, but because whatever he might have said no longer seemed to fit the moment. The version of himself that had controlled the evening was gone, replaced by someone who was now trying to understand where the ground beneath him had shifted, and across from him, Evelyn set her glass down gently, the soft sound almost lost beneath the music, her movements unchanged, steady, unhurried, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all, and perhaps to her, nothing had. Vanessa finally reached for her bag, the motion quick, almost abrupt, like she needed something to hold on to, something tangible. We should go, she said, her voice lower now, no longer performing, no longer certain, and Daniel nodded, though the gesture felt delayed, disconnected, as if he were following a script that no longer belonged to him. He stood, adjusting his jacket, a familiar habit that once carried confidence but now seemed automatic, empty. It was good seeing you, he said, the words incomplete, trailing at the edges, searching for something more, but finding nothing that would not sound hollow. Evelyn looked up at him, her expression calm, unchanged, and for a moment there was no distance, no tension, just clarity, the kind that comes when everything unspoken has already been understood. Take care, Daniel, she replied, her voice gentle, not distant, not cold, just final, and that was what lingered. Not the words themselves, but the absence of anything unfinished behind them. Vanessa did not look at Evelyn again as she turned, her steps measured but slightly quicker than before, and Daniel followed, pausing. Only once, just for a second, as if considering whether to say something else, to ask something he had never asked before. But the moment passed, and he walked away, the sound of their footsteps fading into the soft rhythm of the room. And as the door closed behind them, nothing dramatic followed, no applause, no shift in lighting, just the quiet continuation of everything that had already been in motion. The staff returned to their rhythm, the conversations resumed, and the space settled back into itself, but not exactly the same, because something had been revealed, something that could not be unseen. Alexander remained standing for a moment longer before taking the seat beside Evelyn, not asking, not intruding, simply present, and she did not turn to him right away, her gaze resting briefly on the empty space across the table, not with regret, not with satisfaction, just acknowledgement. Like closing a chapter that no longer needed to be revisited, a server approached quietly, placing a folder beside her, the gesture seamless, expected, and Evelyn opened it with a calm familiarity, scanning the page for only a second before signing her name, the pen moving with the same precision she had carried all evening. No hesitation, no flourish, just completion. She closed the folder and handed it back, and as the server stepped away, she finally leaned back slightly, her shoulders relaxing just enough to signal that the moment was over, not because she had won something, not because she had taken anything back, but because she no longer needed to stand in that space at all. And as she rose from her chair, the room did not react loudly. It simply adjusted, subtle, respectful, the way it had been doing all along. And Evelyn walked toward the exit without looking back, her steps quiet against the polished floor, leaving behind nothing unfinished, nothing unresolved. Just a silence that spoke more clearly than anything she could have said, because in the end, she did not reclaim the past. She moved beyond it.